Welcome to Women Who Move Nations, a podcast by the Public Transport Association, Australia, New Zealand. Each episode, we interview top female executives from the public transport sector in Australia, New Zealand, and around the world. If you're interested in leadership, workplace gender equality, or building clean, green transport for the future, this is the podcast for you. This season is proudly sponsored by NEC Smart Transport Solutions. Find out more at nec.com.au. Now here's your host, Michelle Batsis.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Women Who Move Nations. I'm Michelle Batsis, your host for this podcast episode, and I'm super delighted to have joining us today Dr. Nicole Calmes, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture and the founding director of the Monash University XYX Lab, which leads national and international research in gender and place. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited about this discussion. I'm aware of the work that you do, and it's really on a global scale and really cutting edge. So keen to hear more about that and a bit about your leadership story today. So I might get started and just ask you about your career. So if you can just provide listeners with some insight into your career to date, and how did you find yourself, what inspired you to found the Monash University XYX Lab?
So look, I think I've been interested in feminism since I was a teenager, and there was a component of my architectural education which was around feminism. There was a kind of period where there was a lot of research being done around feminist practices, and it was a really interesting time to be in architecture education and urban design education. And so when I graduated from architecture and was doing my master's, I actually spent some time as a volunteer crisis counsellor with a women's organisation. So really working and hearing the everyday stories of women from really different backgrounds, from different parts of society, very much on the ground work. And so that really shaped my sense of, I guess, the importance of that work. And really, I was always looking for a way to combine my interest in feminism and my interest in women's experiences with the work that I was doing as an architect. I was incredibly passionate about both. So I ended up doing a PhD looking at sexuality in cities and looking at the ways women are either invisible or represented in cities. And so that really became a core focus of my thinking and my research, and really led to the founding of the XYX Lab.
Yeah, fantastic. And just for our listeners, could you just share a bit more about the work that you do in the XYX Lab?
Sure. So the XYX Lab is a research group. We're based at Monash University, and we are, as you can hear, my background is in architecture and urban design, but the researchers that I work with are from a kind of diverse group of design disciplines. So some of them are communication designers, some of them are spatial designers. My co-director, Jean Borden, is a communication designer, but we all have research interests in this relationship between design and urban space and gender. And so that's what we share. And we're also very interested in applied research. So I think sometimes thinking about sexuality and gender can be quite theoretical. We're interested in how we can help shape and make positive impact on the lives of women and girls, but also gender diverse people that are part of the LGBTIQ plus community. So that's our remit.
Fantastic. I mean, what an excellent remit. And, we really need people like you and the people you work with, your team, to really, drive change and different thinking. I think that certainly something that I've reflected on, it's not a blanket approach globally that gender and space and design in our urban environments is always kind of embedded in practice, so I just think there's such opportunity there. So Nicole, in the research that you and your team do, I think it's really important for our listeners to really kind of appreciate and understand, why is it that women and girls and gender diverse people feel at risk in public spaces?
Look, this is such a complex and important question, and we've spent a lot of time looking at the research and really putting together a way to explain this to the organisations that we work with. And essentially, at a high level, I would say that 50% of what women and girls and gender diverse people are experiencing is about the material of the spaces that they're in urban places. So whether or not the place is well maintained or has good lighting and all of those kind of physical things of an urban environment. But the other 50% is about the behaviour of other people. And so when I step through this in more detail with organisations, what we know from the work that we've done and the work that other researchers have done is that, of course, just being a woman or a gender diverse person places you at higher risk of victimisation from gendered violence in cities. So things like sexual harassment and assault. That's just you're at an increased risk if you're a woman or a gender diverse person. Then if you think about age and ability, ethnicity, income, religion, those things actually then can increase your risk of being sexually harassed or assaulted. And so these personal negative experiences really shape how we experience public place and public transport in our everyday lives. The other component to feelings of safety and feeling like you might be at risk of having an unsafe experience is about the stories we hear about public places. In Victoria, where we often have a lot of those stories, and in recent times we've had a lot of stories of women being murdered in public places. They're in the media all the time, and that really significantly shapes women and girls and gender diverse people's experiences of safety when they're moving through cities. We know that things like the cultural things we see in television and movies shape how we might feel in public places, and also the experiences of our friends or relatives. Their negative experiences come into our orbit and really make us think carefully about how we might navigate public places. So then we start to think about this kind of behaviour of other people. So whether a place is really crowded, whether there's nobody around, whether people are unpredictable, which means they might be drug affected, what other people do when something kind of unsavoury happens to us in public places. There's a lot of rhetoric at the moment around bystander intervention. That helps us feel safe or not in public places. And then going back to my original point, which is about the spatial conditions. Is it isolated? Is there poor lighting? Is there a lack of maintenance? Are there multiple exits? All of these things together, and they can't be separated, are what kind of drives a woman and girl's sense of feeling safe or not when they're in public places. Yeah, so that book was developed for my PhD, and it was very interested in thinking about things that we're all very familiar with. So it was about the sexualized representations, for example, in advertising, the hypersexual representations that we see in cities in and around all of the urban environments that we're occupying. And it was a book that was really thinking about how those images shape gendered relationships. So what happens when we are surrounded by sexualized images? How does that perhaps increase sexual harassment or the expectations that women might accept a certain amount of sexual harassment? How does it shape the ways that we think about sexuality in society? And so these were really important things. And actually, even though they were at their inception at that point in time, the work that we've gone on to do in the XYX lab has evidenced that that is actually an issue. So, for example, in some of the public transport projects we've done, they're now excluding sexualised images from bus stops and railway stations, etc., as a result of some of that thinking. So there is a relationship. When we see those images, we do change the way we think about women and girls. And so it is important work.
I mean, I feel inherently in myself as a woman, the times where I feel unsafe, but actually you really articulated so many aspects of that. Like I probably wouldn't even realize, that it's all of those things put together. So I think it's, really critical actually that you've shared that for our listeners to really think about how all of those different aspects lead to people feeling unsafe. I mean, it's just so fantastic that your work leads to these tangible outcomes. Kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, it's not theoretical, right? It's around the practical changes that can be made. In terms of working in this space around gender and urban space and design, not everyone is perhaps like versed in the data and in the issues and really across, some of those challenges that you just talked about. How do you get the cut through with the traditional planners and engineers who work in this space so that they're really taking account of the considerations, and how do they kind of embed that in that work?
Look, there are a few tactics I would say that I've learned to use in this particular space, particularly with public transport. And generally, what I do is I try and speak to organisations in the language and in the modes that they care about. So, for example, with transport service providers, I might actually centre the discussion around the financial cost to their organisations when women prefer to use or buy a car, for example, so that it's in the language that they're kind of interested in. Because, to be honest, not everybody is interested in the experience of women and girls. And so this is actually something that I had to think very carefully about. How do I bring people into this story and get them on side? And so often I talk about, for example, the financial cost that happens when women and girls aren't using public transport. What's the cost when parents are discouraging their daughters from using public transport? How could investment in this issue actually then benefit the service provider? These are kind of things that we have to quantify in a language that they care about. But I do think there is an assumption sometimes that women make, that we kind of assume that people are interested in women's safety. And I have to tell you, they're not. There are lots of things we can care about in terms of social life. And we do need to think about how we can either mandate organisations to address the issue, but also understand how we're always regularly reminded of all of the things that we should care about that are kind of more important than women's safety, for example. So how do we kind of keep drawing people back to this story? How do we keep organisations accountable? How do we understand the connections? You know, what happens to the environment when women don't use public transport? What happens to their access to education or health when they don't use public transport? It's a much more interconnected story. And so it's about finding those leverage points that will get people interested and activated.
So, Nicole, you're talking about working with transport providers and the different kinds of stakeholders you work with. And, you know, something I think that we really talk about in our industry is how we serve diverse communities and our workforce needs to be representative of the communities we serve. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas or strategies, you know, that you would recommend to agencies, operators and suppliers to ensure that they employ that diversity of workforce for the services that they're designing and delivering.
Look, I think this is a really interesting question. One of the things that I think is important for us to consider is that, of course, we would like our organisations to reflect the society that we live in, but we shouldn't allow that to preclude us from actually acting in this space in ways that are productive and evidence-based. And that's because it might take a long time for that to happen. And so if we're kind of waiting for a diverse working organisation to all of a sudden make that change, then we could be waiting a long time. So I'm not sure that they have to be related. And so I think it's possibly perhaps being more effective and efficient and viable to, in the short term, think about our accountability in terms of gender equality policies and legislation, whether that's coming from state or government organisations. And also, you know, there are lots of women and researchers who have engaged in public transport spaces around the prevention of violence and the issues of safety. All of these things can be used to develop plans and protocols to ensure that regardless of who is in charge or making the decisions, that these KPIs are priorities and that we're using an evidence base to equip the work that we need to do. So while I do absolutely support diverse organisations, and I think that is a massive priority, I don't think it should preclude us from acting in this space. I also think that probably one of the key things to do is to collect data about the workforce, but also about experience. So that's been a huge part of our work. How do we collect data that is intersectional, that kind of looks at women's multiple oppressions, that also looks at the issues for women who are in the profession or trying to break into the professions of public transport planning and service provision, and really think about what those barriers are, because that is the evidence base that will help us make change.
I mean, that's such a great point. And the evidence base is so important, isn't it? I mean, we always struggle to necessarily collect all the data that we need, but you can really see how the evidence base in this space is just so critically important. In terms of like thinking about diverse workforces, so perhaps we could explore your team. You know, you kind of mentioned earlier the capabilities that you have, but I wanted to ask in terms of your own leadership of that team, you know, how do you build and maintain the kind of cohesiveness and the interdisciplinary nature of the team that you have at XYX Lab?
So I think it's really important to just remind listeners that I lead the XYX Lab with Gene Borden, and he's a communication designer. And so I think it's very much that combination of my architectural training and his communication design that's really it made the XYX Lab influential. If you look at our work, it is, of course, about architectural urban design, but it's also very much about how we communicate the expectations that we have of people in public transport spaces. And that kind of combination is really important. And it's reflected in the solutions that we propose, which aren't just about material spaces and they're not just about communication campaigns. They're a kind of combination and a confluence of those things. And so the team itself is quite large now. There's, I think, maybe 11 of us in the XYX Lab, senior researchers, mid-career researchers, early career researchers, PhD students, and obviously all of us have got a huge commitment to gender and urban placemaking. And I think the key thing that we do, or perhaps don't do, is we don't aim to all agree on everything. So we know that gender and sex and sexuality is a very contested area, and identity politics has really complicated this in terms of the ways that we start to think about how we might engage with gender equity and inclusion. And I think many organisations are quite rightly, they feel concerned and apprehensive about dealing with the space of gender equity. And so the XYX Lab solution is not to aim for consensus about these issues. What we do is we use a methodology of co-design and avoid bringing our own personal subjective experiences to the work that we do, and allowing communities that we work with to tell us what their concerns are, what the opportunities are, and to think about how this combines with an evidence base and best practice from around the world, so that we're always thinking and referring back to the communities that we hope our work will benefit.
Yeah, I mean, that's so spot on, isn't it? And you articulated that so well, Nicole, like listening to the communities and combining that with the evidence base. I really wanted to ask you about, what you examine in your research, because there's digital and experiential and political and material interventions. And, we're always, I think, for how rapidly we're changing in terms of technology, I'm really keen to talk to you about the digital space. Could you share with our listeners an example of a digital intervention that has successfully addressed gender inequity in urban spaces?
Look, there's a couple of things. I mean, our very recent and a project that we've now rolled out in New South Wales and in Victoria is called Your Ground. And that's a way of crowdsourcing information from women and gender diverse people about their experiences in public spaces. So it's a tool, a digital tool that allows us to get a whole other data set around what's happening for people in public places, and then working with councils and government to understand particular hotspots, but also to understand particular typologies of spaces where things are happening. And often the bad things happen in infrastructural spaces, public transport spaces, and the infrastructure that surrounds public transport spaces. And so that's a kind of example of a method or tool that we use. I do also think that digital interventions are becoming much more palatable from governments and different organisations in terms of solutions. So we're seeing how lighting and different digital tech is being incorporated into public placemaking as a solution. And one of the hugest things that's come out of the research that we're doing is the real need and priority for women and girls around real-time technology. So tracking things, mobility as a service, being able to understand the connections that they need to make in real time and how much that affects their feelings of safety.
PTA ANZ is proud to bring you Season 7 of the Women Who Move Nations public transport podcast in partnership with NEC Australia. With over a century of innovation and a strong commitment to creating a brighter, more inclusive world, NEC is dedicated to gender equality and diverse perspectives and is amplifying the voices of women leaders in public transport. Customers rely on buses being on time. Not early, not late, just on time. Transform your bus operations and on-time running with NEC's Turn by Turn, the first bus navigation system built for the unique roads and routes your buses take every day. Head to nec.com.au/STS for more information.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I even know from my personal experience, real-time information and lighting, all of those things are just so important. I want to talk to you about the concept of women-centered cities, which I understand is a focus in your upcoming monograph called She City. And I love that. Can you share a bit of a sneak peek on some of the innovative ideas or case studies that you're looking to feature?
So She City is a book, as you say, that's focusing on women-centred cities, and it's really consolidating a whole lot of research from women that have been working in this area probably for the last 50 or 60 years. So it's divided into chapters that explore different areas that are critical for thinking about how women should be centred in cities. So everything from sexual harassment to the sexualisation of women, to how to collect gender-sensitive data, gender mainstreaming, which has been a huge part of thinking about how we might equitably think about cities, is also featured in the book. I look at nighttime economies, gender-sensitive design. Transport has its own chapter, but also this process of co-design as a way to start to deal with how we might engage women in city making. So I guess the key themes then come together through a top-down, bottom-up and middle-out approach. So each chapter is thinking about what do the kind of policymakers need to do, what do practitioners need to do, and what do communities need to do. And so I'm trying to tackle it from different scales, but also to empower different communities.
That sounds so great. I can't wait to read the book. I love that you're talking about, for the different stakeholders, what they can do. Like, I think that's such an important perspective to bring. And so in that kind of frame, in terms of, what the opportunities are, what advice or recommendations would you have around what are the steps, the practical steps that, cities could be actioning to become more inclusive and safe for women and girls, in their networks, in the infrastructure, in our urban spaces?
Well, I think that as a foundation, engaging the communities that we hope the work that we do will benefit in the process is key. So that means iteratively including the participation of women and girls in the kind of decision making, and also fundamentally thinking about the equitable division of resources. So that's physically how space is not so much divided, but how we invest in spaces so that it can benefit women and girls as much as it might benefit anybody else. And then I think there are a few things that are coming out of the research that we've done, and we've touched on some of them already, but what seems to rise to the surface again and again is issues of lighting. And that's not just brighter lighting, it's really nuanced lighting that's responsive to the environment. This idea of technology in real time is now being central to public space making, and the opportunity for spatial interventions that aren't always permanent. So how do we activate public places that might happen through events or community building? These are really key things that will increase the presence of women in public places. And when we have more women in public places, we know that women feel safer. So diverse groups of women occupying public places is key. I think also this communication thread is a really important part of the story. So you've heard me talk about the work that I do with Jean Borden. All of the work that we're doing in public places needs to be underpinned by great wayfinding, good direction, clear communication about what we expect from each other, how long it's going to take us to get to certain places, how long we're going to wait for the train. All of these things really need to be front and centre in public placemaking. And then I also think just finally things like making sure that experts are trained in gender-sensitive design so they know what those issues are, that we're aware of the policies and procedures, and that we're very aware of the impact of infrastructure on the experiences of safety for women and girls.
That's incredible. There's so much there to think about. And I really love that you're talking about the digital elements and interventions because, as we know, technology and data is really now underpinning, a lot of our design, the services that are delivered, and will become increasingly more so. I don't know if you can share a little bit more around the responsive lighting you're talking about, just so for our listeners and my perspective, I'm thinking, I've heard about lighting which could be installed where it might brighten, if it detects that someone's kind of walking through a park or that kind of surrounds. Is that what you're talking about in terms of responsive lighting?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. So we had a partnership with Arup, which is at its core a kind of group of engineers, but they have a very innovative lighting section. And so our research that we've done on that crowd mapping project, we worked with Arup to look at the really unsafe hotspots, and often the unsafe spots were actually the places that were the most brightly lit. And that was a kind of revelation, because we were thinking, well, lighting is a key thing that women want to see in cities. So why is it that they feel most unsafe in these very, very brightly lit spaces? And so Arup did a whole lot of measurement of lighting, etc., that was able to tell us that it's this very white, bright light that most people will know what I'm talking about, that kind of football field light that is really alarming actually for most women and girls. And since that time, they've worked and sometimes collaborated with us on thinking about this idea of nuanced lighting. So a warmer light that is really designed with the urban environment in a very specific way. I think some other interesting things that have come out of that research as well, though, is that women now are telling us that they're also very conscious of the environmental impacts of just kind of lighting cities all the time everywhere. And so other researchers, not my group, but other researchers are also doing work on the impact of very, very bright lights on, for example, fauna and flora in parks and recreation spaces. And so I do think we have to think very carefully about how to light cities, and what you're kind of talking about in terms of the activated light might be a really great response to that, because it's not on all the time and very, very bright. It can kind of be responsive.
So you're talking about other researchers, and it just gets me thinking, if maybe we take a bit of a global perspective on this, in your research and in your networks, I'm wondering if you can share some insights into, how do issues of gender and urban space manifest, differently across the world in different cities, or, is there kind of, differences and learnings that you've kind of taking away from those connections?
Well, one of the earliest things that we found when we were doing international research, so we did a project that was across 5 continents. So it was a project that looked at young women's experiences in Sydney, in Lima, in Madrid, in Delhi, and Kampala, which is in Uganda. And what came out of that research, which actually led to the whole raft of work that we've been doing in public transport, is that public transport spaces were in every single city. And if you think about how diverse those cities are, they were the most challenging spaces for young women in terms of safety and sexual harassment. So the first thing I would say is that there are aspects of women's struggle and concerns internationally that is completely shared, and public transport is one of those spaces. I mean, that's not a happy story, but it's an important one. And what it means is that the issue crosses culture, it crosses age, sexuality, socioeconomic class, all of it doesn't matter. It's just an incredibly tricky environment. And we think that's because of the anonymity, also because of the fact that it's either mostly overcrowded or can be quite deserted. And this kind of leads to a tension and a risk, or a feeling of risk, that's really critical to women's sense of safety. And also some people either, they may not have a choice but to use it. So there's really important things that we need to think about in terms of public transport. If I'm thinking about how things are different, that's slightly more complex, because women can have very different perspectives about the same space. So one woman might say that a place makes her feel unsafe for particular reasons, and another may have a divergent perspective. So when we start to drill down to the very particularities of spaces, then we start to see some difference. But generally, infrastructural spaces, public transport spaces, these are just places that are universally unsafe and create feelings of apprehension and risk for women and girls.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's incredible to hear that research that you did across different cities and some of the commonalities in that as well. Honestly, Nicole, your team is doing such important work. It really is a privilege to be interviewing you on this podcast to talk about it. I just think it's so important that we profile it. I wanted to ask, in terms of going forward, what are you planning, or what are you most excited about in terms of future projects or research that you'd be doing in this kind of intersection of gender and urban design?
Well, part of the reason that we've done so much work in public transport is because of the collaborations we've had. So that research that I just spoke about in the 5 cities was undertaken with Plan International, who are a not-for-profit organisation, huge across the world. And so that partnership's critical. The work that we've then gone on to do, very particularly around Victorian public transport spaces, was funded by the Victorian State Government and led to a series of toolkits called the Tramlab Toolkits. And so that project with La Trobe University was, that's still now having impact across Victoria, and actually not just in Victoria, but across Australia and elsewhere. So these toolkits, we're really looking to see the impact of how organisations are using them. One is about how to collect data. One is about how to train your staff in gender-sensitive ways. Another toolkit is about placemaking. And the other toolkit is about communication campaigns. And so there's a whole, as you were talking about before, very much not one single solution, but different approaches that we need to be taking to think about how we might solve the public transport conundrum. So for me, the future projects are really about continuing to understand how we can get traction with communities, how we can measure the impact. So that's a very important part of the work that I do as a researcher. We need to find out, are people using the work that we do, and is it actually changing the lives of women and girls? So that's critical to the future work that the XYX Lab will be doing. Obviously, we work in other areas related to gender and public place as well. So, and they're all kind of centred around gendered violence and issues of safety. So they're things that are also kind of bubbling along as well.
Nicole, you talked about measuring the effect or the impact of your work. I'm just wondering if you can share any more about that, because actually I think sometimes we struggle to be able to evaluate, interventions, in a way that's kind of evidence-based. I don't know if you can share just a little bit more around that, how you approach the measurement.
So there's a couple of things that I might say in response to that. One is that with the Your Ground project, the crowd mapping project, we do that iteratively. So we're about to do another iteration of that project. We did it in 2020 and we'll probably do the next one next year. So that will actually help us measure the change. So we'll be able to see if some of those unsafe places that have been maybe addressed by local communities and councils, whether or not there is change, and whether or not women and girls and gender diverse people do feel safer in those areas. So that kind of broad, again, participatory relationship with women to measure those spaces is one very effective way that we can document whether or not we're having impact. Another way is, so yesterday, this is International Women's Day today, and I was on a webinar with some people from local council, and I was kind of giving a presentation, but then they were presenting their case studies, and I was just absolutely gobsmacked because all of these organisations, which we had worked with, were in detail describing how they had used our toolkits to develop their strategies to dealing with tricky public spaces, and the kind of audits that they put in place with their communities, with their work groups, but also with women in their communities to actually develop the projects. And then they had pictures of these new lighting proposals and public artworks and placemaking schemes that had transformed places. And, that to me is really important and impactful work that I can see there. Now, my job then is to kind of follow up and to document that in a way that can be communicated in a research way. But those kinds of aspects of measuring change and impact are incredibly important to our work as well.
Nicole, I'm going to finish on my last question. And it's really to get your advice for our listeners, particularly people who are younger professionals in the public transport industry who are interested in exploring gender inequities in urban design and transport planning. What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. One of the things that we haven't touched on is something that I do often talk about with public transport stakeholders and organisations, and actually all of the organisations that we work with, which is for women in particular, not to make assumptions that they can translate their own experiences of public place and public transport into the work that they do. I think that's a really critical error that sometimes happens, and there's a good reason why it happens. What most of us would have experienced is being brought into a meeting or brought into a design team to be the woman that's there to speak for all women everywhere and anywhere. And that's what happens when you're in organisations that are male dominated. And so then we start to see a really, really big problem where you're starting to use your personal experience as a proxy for every woman's experiences. So one of my key things would be to not do that, to think about how you can engage the stories of women more broadly in the processes and work that you do, and ensure that the ways that you're responding to public places, whether you're a man or a woman, is evidence-based. And the way to do that is to gather the experiences and the research and not to draw on the experiences that might relate to you personally. So I've said it earlier in the podcast discussion that we must be very aware of the work that we're doing, in that it should benefit the people of those communities. And so that must be at the forefront of all the decisions that we make, and it has to be evidence-based.
That's awesome advice, Nicole. I really appreciate you sharing a bit more on that point, and something for all of us to think about. We're at the end of this episode, and Nicole, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, and really giving our listeners, I think, a lot to think about. You know, this is such an important issue, and yeah, it's just so great to have this opportunity to raise, you know, your work and the profile of that work in people's minds who work in public transport. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I really appreciate the opportunity as well. And yeah, I'm very grateful.
That was Nicole Calmes, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture, and also the founding director of Monash University's XYX Lab. I'm Michelle Batsis, Executive Director of Future Mobility at the Department of Transport and Planning, and thank you for listening to this episode of Women Who Move Nations.
Thank you for listening to Women Who Move Nations, the Public Transport Podcast. We're proud to deliver this episode in partnership with NEC Smart Transport Solutions. To find out more, visit nec.com.au. This series is produced by Jamie Leowen and Sophia Dickinson for the Public Transport Association Australia, New Zealand. To find out more, please visit our website ptaanz.org. Tune in for more soon.